The hip-hop world shifted the moment Poo Shiesty spoke in a way that quietly redefined his relationship with Gucci Mane. What had long been presented as a clear mentor-protégé bond under the 1017 banner no longer appeared simple or unified. Instead, it felt strained, layered, and unresolved. Recent lyrics, fragments of prison phone conversations circulating online, and a pattern of deliberate silence began forming a narrative that listeners could not dismiss. This was not an impulsive outburst or a careless statement. It arrived measured and intentional, built on implication rather than explanation. A familiar language of restraint, designed to be understood without being fully revealed. The atmosphere around the situation shifted almost immediately. Online, timelines became archives. Fans revisited lyrics, timestamps, and past interviews, connecting details that had always been visible but rarely questioned. References to the absence of public affiliation and the quiet disappearance of once frequent acknowledgments stood out. The tone carried no visible anger. It was controlled, almost procedural, suggesting decisions made behind closed doors that had left lasting discomfort. Observers within the industry noted that what surfaced was not disorder, but positioning. When an artist chooses to speak at a moment when silence would offer protection, it suggests something deeper than attention-seeking. It suggests a shift in balance. Timing amplified the weight of the message. These words surfaced while wider conversations about label loyalty, creative control, and post-signing realities were already circulating through the culture. Fans returned to early rollout moments, contract-era optimism, and periods of visible alignment. Quietly, questions emerged about expectations that may never have fully matched. In this space, nuance mattered. Every pause, every absence, every carefully chosen phrase carried consequence. The message of this early chapter was restrained but clear. This was not collapse. It was correction, a recognition that the public story no longer reflected the private experience, and once acknowledged, that divide could not be sealed again. To understand the gravity of SHYY's words, the timeline matters. The rise under 1017 was rapid and forceful. Momentum built quickly. Success followed. From the outside, the path appeared smooth. Yet growth at that speed has a way of exposing pressure points, especially when expectations remain unspoken. That rise was fueled by authenticity and regional intensity, and with it came a desire for creative agency that does not always align easily with established systems. As the work expanded, subtle changes became noticeable. The sound evolved. The messaging sharpened. Gaps between releases felt heavier. Industry discussion pointed toward quiet negotiations over direction, control, and long-term vision. Against that backdrop, Shiesty's recent words carried their weight. They did not accuse. They reframed. They reframed the moment. Not as failure, but as an acknowledgement that success does not automatically translate into fulfillment. That tension, between achievement and satisfaction, is one many artists confront once the early momentum fades and the realities of structure set in. What gave these statements their weight was the absence of spectacle. There were no extended rants, no public confrontations, no viral provocation, only selective references and prolonged quiet. That restraint mattered. It mirrored how real conflicts often unfold beyond the spotlight, where enough is said to be understood, but not so much that future paths are permanently closed. Within the culture, meaning is often carried in what remains unsaid. Here, the silence spoke clearly. Observers noted that the situation resonated because it reflected broader questions the industry has wrestled with for years. Who ultimately holds the vision? Who controls the story? And how an artist preserves identity while navigating expansion at a global scale. SHYY's words did not exist in isolation. They echoed a systemic pressure that extends far beyond a single relationship. That is why the response moved quickly past fan discussion and into professional spaces. Once the signal was sent, attention sharpened. Old clips resurfaced. Past interviews were revisited. Early optimism was placed beside present restraint. This was not passive consumption. It was examination. The silence from Gucci's side became part of that examination. Not as confirmation, but as context. In hip-hop, silence is rarely neutral. It can function as strategy, but it also creates space for interpretation. Analysts pointed out that SHYY's framing maintained a careful balance. It avoided open disrespect while still asserting distance. That distinction mattered. It suggested intention rather than impulse, evolution rather than defiance. Within the streets, growth handled with discipline carries its own credibility. This moment was not about erasing the past. It was about defining the present. Industry voices focused on the structural realities beneath the surface. Label relationships are complex systems, shaped by contracts, expectations, and long timelines. Shifts rarely occur publicly or quickly. Conversations about ownership, publishing, and future direction often unfold alongside visible quiet. A lack of noise does not indicate inactivity. It often signals that decisions are being made away from view. What sustained attention was consistency. There were no contradictions, no retractions. The message remained intact. That steadiness transformed perception. What could have been dismissed as speculation began to feel like an announcement. The culture recognized the language, and it moved accordingly. Legacy conversations carry a different weight when they come from artists who have already experienced success. SHYY's posture suggested a longer view, one in which immediate wins no longer outweigh the importance of control, direction, and permanence. That perspective is often described as the dividing line between momentary visibility and lasting presence. The focus shifts away from numbers alone and toward authorship of one's path. Durability becomes the measure. For Gucci, the moment quietly illuminated a separate challenge. Mentorship, especially across generations, requires constant adjustment. Systems built over decades do not always move at the pace of artists shaped by the internet era. Even where respect remains intact, that difference in speed and expectation can create tension. The culture does not always search for a villain. At times, it simply observes a crossroads. The impact extended beyond the individuals involved. Across the industry, younger artists watched closely, reading the situation as instruction. Speak with intention. Move deliberately. Say only what is necessary. Allow the message to stand on its own. That lesson traveled far beyond this single moment. As discussion continued, one point remained consistent. This was not collapse. It was transition. And transitions, when handled with restraint, have the ability to reshape power without public damage. Street logic met industry reality. The effects lingered. Music was heard differently. Interviews were examined with sharper focus. Upcoming releases carried added context. Attention stayed not because of confrontation, but because both sides appeared oriented toward forward movement rather than public exchange. That restraint signaled professionalism. The culture tends to value moments like this not for spectacle, but for clarity. Listeners gained insight into how artists guard their vision. The industry was reminded, again, that silence and strategy often carry more weight than headlines. Discipline rarely goes unnoticed. Over time, this chapter came to feel less like disruption and more like definition. A pivot rather than an explosion. An evolution. This is often how power shifts in hip-hop, quietly, decisively, without announcement. The tone eventually changed. What had once been coded grew more direct. Statements delivered through lyrics, intermediaries, and private conversations began circulating with a clearer implication. Something, somewhere within the 1017 structure, felt misaligned. References surfaced to stalled momentum, to absence, to loyalty perceived as uneven. In rap culture, such signals are not casual. They mark a threshold. They suggest a boundary has been crossed. What intensified the response was the contrast with Gucci Mane's established image. His legacy is built on resilience, independence, and control over narrative. When concerns appear to emerge from within that circle, they unsettle expectations. Not because they are confirmed, but because they challenge a long-held perception. According to those close to the situation, there was a feeling that momentum had not been protected during critical periods. Visibility, placement, and support, details that can feel minor, take on greater meaning when progress slows. Artists noticed the shift immediately. Public reaction fractured along familiar lines. Some pointed to Gucci's history, his longevity, and the many careers shaped under his leadership. Others argued that past success does not negate present responsibility. Both positions existed simultaneously. What became difficult to deny was the visible distance. The absence of alignment, the lack of shared presence, the quiet separation. Once that distance enters public view, resolution becomes more complex. Pride intervenes. Business becomes personal. And what began as an internal reckoning is now understood as something far more consequential. The other view held that legacy does not cancel present responsibility. Both realities can exist at once. What became impossible to ignore was the visible shift in alignment. The relationship no longer appeared unified. Body language changed. Public affirmation disappeared. Silence settled in. Together, these details formed a picture of distance. And once that distance enters public view, repair becomes more difficult. Pride begins to shape decisions. Business turns personal. It is often at that point that a private disagreement crosses into public consequence. As the story moved beyond inner circles, the industry paid closer attention. Labels, artists, and executives understood what was unfolding. This was no longer about two individuals. It functioned as a warning, illustrating how quickly alliances can weaken when expectations diverge. Gucci Mane's silence continued, and with it, speculation intensified. In hip-hop, silence is rarely neutral. It is often strategic, chosen to avoid amplifying a narrative. But silence also creates space, and that space was filled rapidly by interpretation. At the same time, SHYY's name continued to circulate despite his circumstances. That persistence mattered. Relevance is not accidental. Ongoing conversation sustains visibility, and visibility carries influence. The moment revealed how presence can exist even without access, and how narrative can move independently of physical absence. Privately, questions reportedly emerged about whether this tension would settle over time or harden into separation. History suggests that personal conflicts in rap can soften, but business fractures tend to endure. The situation also reopened broader conversations about artist support, particularly during periods of vulnerability. How support is offered, or withheld, during difficult moments leaves a lasting imprint. In the public imagination, the framing subtly shifted. Gucci Mane was increasingly viewed less as a mentor and more as an executive. That distinction is not inherently negative, but it reshapes expectation and responsibility. What unfolded was not rooted in criminal allegation or street dispute. It centered on trust, control, and the perception of abandonment. In hip-hop, those themes carry unusual weight. They reach deeper than spectacle because they touch on survival, identity, and memory. Regardless of outcome, the moment leaves a mark. SHYY and Gucci Mane embody two different generations of endurance within the culture. One carved the path. The other moved through it at speed. When those trajectories intersect, friction is almost inevitable. No formal reconciliation has been announced. No definitive separation has been declared. Yet distance remains perceptible. Energy often communicates more clearly than statements. For artists watching closely, the implications are direct. Agreements matter. Communication matters. Loyalty is tested most sharply when circumstances change. For executives, the reminder is equally clear. Artists remember who remained present when conditions became uncomfortable. Public perception shifted on both sides. One figure came to represent an artist asserting control over his future. The other appeared as a leader preserving structure and brand. Neither position is inherently wrong, but when expectations fail to align, conflict becomes difficult to avoid. Hip-hop has always lived at the intersection of tension, truth, and transformation. This story exists squarely within that space. However it resolves, the narrative has already changed. And as events continue to unfold, one reality remains consistent. The silence, the lyrics, and the timing continue to communicate, carefully, deliberately, and with lasting effect.